9/11 is not something that is just going to go away. This is very pertinent to us today. I wish to further the investigation, and I want to make a difference because I want this to be a safe and better place for my children.
It took some kind of consciousness raising on my part before I was willing to look at the possibilities. And really, you need to go where the evidence leads.
Let's look at it objectively. Let's look at the evidence.
Is it ever reasonable to restrict constitutional freedoms in the name of fighting terrorism?
In our opinion, no.
Let me explain to the audience what's happened here. Okay, back in the 80s, 1980s, the Department of Justice proposed legislation to fight terrorism. And this legislation took away many of our constitutional rights and civil liberties. One of the authors, a female attorney with the Department of Justice, publicly made this statement. I've got her name on my file someplace. That before this passes, people will have to be killed. Well, so that was the reason, I feel, for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Unfortunately for them, fortunately for us, the good guys, there were only 6 people killed, not enough to pass the legislation. So what happened is, 3 years later, no, 93, 2 years later, April 19, 1995, down comes Oklahoma City Murrah building, 168 people killed. 1 year later, the anti-terrorism legislation that takes away many of our constitutional rights and civil liberties is passed. And now with the Twin Towers World Trade Center episode, our Congress is now proposing further restrictions on our constitutional rights and civil liberties. These explosions, these terrorist acts, were an excuse to pass anti-terrorism legislation.
And then to implement.
And then, yes. And this is what's happening in the world today. And that's why our intelligence people are not only knew about it in advance, but probably involved. There's no question. You cannot possibly have an operation of this magnitude without our people knowing about it. Are you going to tell me that they're not going to know about the terrorists coming and going? By the way, this operation, based on information that's come out since the attack, the terrorist attack, was planned in England, London, England. The training took place in Afghanistan and in the United States. And these terrorists came in and took pilot training here. And as I said earlier, Bin Laden's phone conversations were monitored, according to the press, in February 1998. Are you going to say they didn't monitor them after that? No, no.
Wait.
No. But they have tasks on virtually everybody in America. This was part of the anti-terrorism legislation that was passed after Oklahoma City.
Well, that's exactly what Adolf Hitler did when he took down the Reichstag.
The only way they can pass this bill is by creating and sustaining a panic atmosphere. That atmosphere is not justified. Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, then the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no. That's what I call fear-mongering. Unjustified.
Expect that building to collapse.
Cars, debris everywhere. Again, you'll take a look at it. Again, this is not one of the Twin Towers. This is a building that fell just moments ago. It had been burning for hours. There's Building 7, 47 stories.
The commercial airline. That second one wasn't no commercial. No, the second one definitely didn't have any markings on it that I saw. No, I didn't see it. The second one, it has, like those camouflage things, No emblems, no logos.
The second plane was an unmarked silver fuselage.
I'd say it was like a two-engine plane or something. But it didn't look like an airline to me because it was flat.
This one did it on work something. Okay.
A black plane.
Yeah, we see it going around. He was. Yeah.
Yeah, we just saw it. A black plane.
Yeah, we see it going around. He was.
The plane wasn't no airline or anything. It was a twin-engine, big gray plane.
When you saw the second one happen, what did it look like?
It was a much smaller plane, but someone said it looked like a military plane, but I'm not sure. I don't know much about airplanes.
Mark, were you close enough to be able to see any markings on the airplane?
It definitely did not look like a commercial plane. I didn't see any windows on the side.
No, it was a black plane. It looked like a fighter jet.
It looked like a fighter jet.
And it didn't look like a commercial jet.
It was a military plane.
Could be a drone aircraft. That's an aircraft that's guided electronically to its target without having a pilot.
The plane circle around and actually come on to the opposite side of the building and smash into the trade center. It was great, to be honest with you.
We watched the first explosion. As we watched the buildings, we saw a black, very large airplane fly right into the second building. It came out of the south, right in front of our eyes. It was so surreal, like a movie set.
The only other thing that was found was the engine on Murray Street, and the engine on Murray Street has been identified as either a CFM-56. CFM stands for Senecma, or the CF-6, which was a 767 engine, which was developed out of the CFM-56. But whichever one it was, the CF-6 or the CFM-56, it had to be General Electric. And unfortunately, or fortunately, United Airlines used strictly Pratt & Whitney. So that engine that you see flying off, and that engine they say is from 175, isn't from 175 because the guys whose job was to dump it off there dumped off the wrong engine.
September 11, 2001. The Washington Post claims reports that U.S. air defenses scrambled jets that day and were ready to shoot down United Flight 93 are false. The truth is the military never had any of the hijacked airliners in its sights. The troubling part of the story is officials with both NORAD and the FAA continued to give inaccurate information about the attacks for 2 years after 9/11. A member of the 9/11 Commission says his panel didn't trust testimony from Pentagon officials about the timeline of events, so they referred their concerns to the Pentagon Inspector General and even considered taking it to the Justice Department for a possible criminal probe. The Pentagon admitted that it did make mistakes, but insists they have since corrected them, and they said they found nothing that indicates the testimony to the 9/11 Commission was knowingly false. Here's the question. What does it mean if the 9/11 Commission thought the Pentagon was not telling the truth about the day of the attacks? Testimony from Pentagon officials about the timeline of events on that fateful day, September 11th. The question we ask is, what does it mean if the 9/11 Commission thought the Pentagon wasn't telling the truth? Barry writes from El Cajon, California, business as usual. The chain of command versus accountability, always a difficult balancing act for the military and the civilians supervising them. But that's no excuse for hiding the truth, as people tend not to trust what they cannot see. Gail in Front Royal, Virginia, it means the Pentagon stole the true extent of the heroism shown on Flight 93 from those amazing people just to cover their butts. If we knew our military never had any of those airlines in their sights on 9/11, we might think the Pentagon's leadership is incompetent. Mark in Massachusetts, it means the Pentagon believed it could lie and get away with it. Marie in Bartlett, Illinois, the 9/11 Commission failed. If they mulled criminal charges because they doubted the veracity of testimony from Pentagon personnel, why did they stop at that? And why say so now? If persons are suspected of lying, they must be brought up on charges and found either guilty or innocent. The Commission declared themselves to be judge and jury, and the kangaroo court verdict was not guilty. About volunteering to provide the government with my telephone records and yours and tens of millions of other Americans. Shortly after 9/11, AT&T, Verizon, and Bell South began providing the super-secret NSA with information on phone calls of millions of our citizens. All part of the war on terror, President Bush says. Why don't you go find Osama bin Laden and seal the country's borders and start inspecting the containers that come into our ports? The president rushed out this morning in the wake of this front-page story in USA Today and declared the government's doing nothing wrong and all this is just fine. Is it? Is it legal? Then why did the Justice Department suddenly drop its investigation of the warrantless spying on citizens? Because the NSA said Justice Department lawyers didn't have the necessary security clearance to do the investigation. Read that sentence again. A secret government agency has told our Justice Department that it's not allowed to investigate it. And the Justice Department just says okay and drops the whole thing. We're in some serious trouble here.
FBI has access to the data collected, which is basically the emails of virtually everybody in the country. All the congressional members are on the surveillance too. It's not, no one's excluded. They're all included. So yes, this can happen to anyone. If they
Pentagon, the day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on foreign terrorists.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, the world changed. And in the rush to fund the war on terrorism, the war on waste seems to have been forgotten.
My 03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending.
More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. To understand.
Well, we don't know what they spend it on.
Jim Minery, a former Marine turned whistleblower, is risking his job by speaking out for the first time about the millions he noticed were missing from one defense agency's balance sheets. Minery tried to follow the money trail, even crisscrossing the country looking for records.
The director looked at me and he said, "Why do you care about this stuff?" It took me aback, you know. My supervisor asked me why I care about doing a good job. So
he was reassigned and says officials then covered up the problem by just writing it off.
They got to cover it up. That's where the corruption comes in.
You might have missed this in the days following the Thanksgiving holiday, but President Obama signed a piece of whistleblower legislation that affords greater protection to federal employees who expose fraud, waste, and abuse in government operations. But the bill is a far cry from the reality on the ground, because to date, Obama has charged more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than any prior administration combined. Because to date, Obama has charged more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than any prior administration combined.
All right, I'm Mike Springman. Some 15 years ago now, I was chief of the visa section at the CIA's consulate at Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. In Jeddah?
Yeah.
People were being brought there from all over the Middle East for visas to come to the United States. And I was told they were terrorists that were recruited to come to the U.S. for training and shipped back to Afghanistan for fighting the Soviet soldiers. And this was, when I was there, this was between 1987 and 1989. The reason why there was this pressure, the reason why these guys who were not businessmen, who were not educated, why visas were being demanded for them. And, you know, when I put the pieces together from my three contacts, it was people who were who were brought here, who were recruited by the CIA and its asset, Osama bin Laden, to come to the United States for training as terrorists and to return them to Afghanistan to fight with the Soviet soldiers there. My understanding from talking to Celerino Castillo, who was a drug enforcement officer in Central America, was this was a favorite ploy of the CIA. They wanted to slip their guys into the United States, and they would have them apply through a legitimate travel agent, often through a legitimate tour group. You know, you'd have, I don't know, 20 people from the church school or the Lawyers Association or something would be going to the United States, and they get their guys in, they slip the paperwork and the visas in with the group. The travel agent would take care of them, bring them to the American diplomatic post. They get their visa stamped and hand them back. You know, it's cover. It's nobody's there to ask questions. You're in with a legitimate group. You know, why ask questions? At the time, I thought that my questioning what was going on, my filing a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, got them to pull in their horns. Reading about the 15 of the 19 hijackers getting visas from the CIA's consulate in Jeddah, I thought, obviously, I didn't do any good at all. About the 15 of the 19 hijackers getting visas from the CIA's consulate in Jeddah, I thought, obviously, I didn't do any good at all. I was amazed at how subservient the Department of State was to the CIA, which I guess is natural given the huge contingent of spooks that work for the State Department or who ostensibly work for the State Department. And I really think that the security that they got, where they destroyed files or made files disappear that I was interested in. For example, I wanted the cable that talked about the Chinese Silkworm missiles were coming through the Jeddah port. They can't find it anymore. So, you know, the secrecy basically covers up wrongdoing, it covers up incompetence, and it covers up stupidity, and it covers up really dangerous programs that the U.S. government is involved in.
They got to cover it up. That's where the corruption comes in.
Yeah, I've been stonewalled for 15 years by the U.S. government as far as the Freedom of Information Act goes. I mean, I'm amazed at how the law of the land isn't the law of the land. But
why would they stonewall you?
Basically because they don't want to give up information. They don't want people to know what the government is doing. Two, because if the truth ever did get out as to what the hell they were doing in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, that people might scream for somebody's heads. You know, it might not happen. I mean, the American people don't want control of the CIA. There's an awful lot of people who think the agency is a wonderful institution and is protecting America instead of endangering America, which in fact it is doing.
Hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
The FBI's 10 Most Wanted poster reads, quote, Osama bin Laden is wanted in connection with the August 7, 1998 bombings of the United States embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. These attacks killed over 200 people. In addition, bin Laden is a suspect in other terrorist attacks throughout the world. It turns out, though, bin Laden has never been indicted for 9/11. And
Susan Lindauer, ex-CIA asset and author of the book Extreme Prejudice.
Pleased to be here. I have waited 10 years to tell this story. I remember after 9/11 when my CIA handler Richard Fuse told me that there really wasn't going to be much of a 9/11 investigation. And we were going to try to keep the people calm. That's what he said. We're going to keep them calm. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we don't really need them to know everything that we were doing before 9/11. And I said, well, why? What do you think what do you think's going to happen when they find out that you didn't tell them the truth? Why don't you just tell them the truth right now? And he said, well, that's not really what they want to do. So I'm a back channel, which means that the U.S. government gives me messages to give the Iraqis, and then the Iraqis give me messages to give to Washington. So I know everything. Every single conversation is going through me. I will tell you straight off the bat that right after 9/11, my CIA handler received a $13 million payoff from the 9/11 investigation that was supposed to be money used for the Iraqi, to secure Iraq's cooperation. And I ended up getting indicted on the Patriot Act. I was the second non-Arab American ever indicted on the Patriot Act after Jose Padilla had spoken to the staff of Senator John McCain and Senator Trent Lott. And I said, I'm an asset who covered Iraq and Libya at the United Nations, and I have a story to tell, and you need to hear what I have to say. And within 30 days, I am not making this up, this is actually, thanks to the Patriot Act, all of my phone calls to these offices are taped by the FBI, so I can actually prove that they occurred. And I have the dates, I have the actual phone conversations on tape. And within 30 days of those conversations, I woke up to hear the FBI pounding at my door, and I got up out of bed and I looked out the window, and there are men in flak jackets in my porch. And I opened the door, and they come into my house, and they're like, Ms. Susan, and the FBI agent is shaking. He's shaking. And he said, you are Susan Lindauer, you are hereby notified, you are under arrest on the Patriot Act. He read me my Miranda rights, and I was just like, what are you talking about? I haven't broken any laws that I can think of, and I have no idea what you say that I've done. That began a 5-year indictment, 5-year nightmare on the Patriot Act. I was never taken to trial. Answer as honestly as I can. I do not have all the answers. I believe there were both hijackings and a controlled demolition scenario, and I'll explain to you how the whole thing fits together. And you may disagree, and that's okay if you disagree with me. So I believe both of them happened, okay? And it's also very important for you to know that as the 10-year anniversary of 9/11 comes up, no offense, but you guys have no idea what actually happened. This is like the lies are so much bigger than what you know. And it's so much deeper, and it's so much more tragic once you have the truth. It is very important for you to understand that this story with 9/11 also ties in deeply to what happened with Iraq. And contrary to everything you were told, the Iraqis were not resistant to weapons inspections. And I can tell you that in April of 2001, I was summoned to my CIA handler, Dr. Richard Few, and he said he had a message for me to deliver to New York at the earliest possible convenience. And the message was this: we are looking for information on a conspiracy to hijack airplanes. We expect the target to be the World Trade Center. We think they're going to fly the airplanes into the World Trade Center. They're going to help us identify who they are, where they're meeting, what their nationalities are, anything like this. And he says, he gives me a message, and he says, we want this information, and I want you to tell the Iraqis that if they fail to give us this information, and if it is later determined that they knew the information and they did not give it to us, then the United States is prepared to go to war with Iraq. Okay, this is April of 2001. Well, I went up to New York, and I was we were in the middle of these great negotiations. We already had an invitation, from February of 2001, we have an invitation for the FBI to come to Baghdad. So I go up to New York. I'm very pleasant. I'm very polite. There's no reason to be nasty with these people. They want peace. I say, hey, could you please send a message to Baghdad? We'd like this information. If you come across anything, Saddam had been one of our best sources on terrorism throughout the 1990s. Iraq hated terrorism because they believed that they hated Islamic jihadis. He did. Whether you like Saddam or not, whether you hate Saddam or not, he hated Islamic conservatives. He was convinced that they would take advantage of the crumbling of authority in Baghdad under the sanctions, and that they would then try to overturn his government, and the poverty of the people from the sanctions would fuel this problem, would help overturn his government. So he wanted to help us at every turn, keep these people from becoming too powerful. Okay, the message to Baghdad, let them know we're looking for this, thanks. And the message from the Iraqis in April of 2001 is, hey, send the FBI. We've already agreed to send we've already invited you to send the FBI. Come on. Tell them, just bring them on. Sure. Wow, you didn't know that, did you? Okay, so I go back to Washington, and I get a phone call from Richard. He said, come down to my office. I want to hear what they said. I go down, I said, I was real polite. I gave him the message, sure. He said, I didn't tell you to be nice. He's like, you go back to New York and you deliver the message exactly the way that I told you to deliver the message. And I said, well, Richard, I don't want them to think I'm threatening them because, I believe in negotiations and conflict resolution. He said, no, I don't want them to think you are threatening them. And he said, I don't want them to think I am threatening them. I want you to tell them this threat of war originates at the highest level of government, above the CIA director and above the Secretary of State. That it would be three men: President George Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and no one else. Those are the three people who are threatening war. And I want to be really clear about the message that I was ordered to give them. We demand that you turn over any fragment of intelligence outlining a conspiracy involving airplane hijackings and a strike on the World Trade Center. If you withhold this information, if we discover that you have withheld this information and the attack occurs, then we will bomb you back to the Stone Age. You will be bombed harder than you've ever been bombed before. You will be destroyed. And believe me, by this point, we just wanted to get rid of the sanctions. The Iraqis were like, if they don't get rid of the sanctions, you bet. We'll give them anything they want. So before 9/11, you could have had every single thing you possibly could dream of. And if the CIA could have thought of more to ask for, we would have. We would have asked for, it was shameless. Okay, so you have peace that's breaking out in the Middle East. You have the 9/11 warnings. And then in August of 2001, we went into high activity mode. I can tell you the exact day, on August 2nd, and after I tell you this, I'll open it up to questions. On On August 2nd was the Senate nomination hearings for Robert Mueller, to head the FBI. He was going to be the FBI director. And I was on the phone with my CIA handler, Richard Hughes, and I said, there's not one single terrorism investigation this man hasn't thrown. He threw the Oklahoma City bombing investigation. He threw Lockerbie. And I said, this man should not be the FBI director when this next attack occurs. And Richard Hughes said to me, my God, what if there is no FBI director when this happens? I said, do you think it's that soon? Do you think the attack is imminent? He said, oh yeah. He said, it's absolutely just in the next couple of weeks. He said, I don't want, and I said, well, God, Richard, I'll go back to New York right now, and I'll pump the Iraqis and see if they've got anything from Baghdad. I'll see if they have any news for us. And he said, oh my God, Susan, do not go back to New York City. It's too dangerous. We are expecting the use of a miniature thermonuclear device. And they were not afraid that I was going to be hurt by like falling debris in the World Trade Center. I wasn't going to be at the World Trade Center. They were afraid of radiation contamination, like the winds blowing the radioactive stuff. And that's what he was like, don't go up there. We're expecting mass casualties. And I said, well, Richard, I'll go up the day after. I can tell you the exact day. It was a Thursday. And I said, I will go up to New York on Saturday and I'll report to you on Monday. And we'll just find out if the Iraqis have anything to give us. I went up to New York. The Iraqis said, ain't got nothing. We don't know. We don't know anything about this. You keep telling us about this. The only way we know about it is because you're talking about it. But we don't have any information to give you. And if we did, we understand the consequences. We know that if we don't help you, you're going to go to war with us if you think we did. And if there was anything we could give you, we would do it. So I go back and I report that on August 6th. On August 6th, there is a memo to the president telling him that this is a high security threat, that it is an emergency level, that it's imminent. Okay. But I did what I did. And when I did that, I apparently tripped some wires because it denied the White House, it denied the Justice Department and the Attorney General's office of deniability, plausible deniability. And that's very important. And that is why they came after me so hard and tried to destroy me utterly, because they could not admit to you that we had absolutely anticipated this thing. We knew it was going to happen exactly as it did go down. This is direct primary knowledge from my own experience. But what I'm going to tell you now is from somebody else, okay? And so I distinguish these two things. I have been told that by somebody who saw the videos that at the World Trade Center from approximately August 23rd, my friend says that at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, strange vans, and there were just maybe 3 of them, he said, that not just a couple. The way he put it was a couple of vans. So we're thinking 3, possibly 4, but most likely 3. A couple of vans arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning after the janitorial trucks had left the building. It's very important because they were able to identify the vans according to make, model, color, and there were no markings on the vans, but the janitorial vans did have markings. And so they were able to distinguish that these are not the same vans. And they know how the janitorial trucks left the building, and they actually tracked the paths that the janitorial trucks took to drive home. Like the janitorial workers were driving down certain roads to get over to their houses, and the CIA, the FBI, the NSA folks tracked those people home. And he was quite convinced that these are not the same trucks. And between the hours of 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock, these trucks had never been in this building before. It was an anomaly, definitely. It wasn't like it was going on for months and months and it just continued. They showed up for 10 days, 10 or 11 days approximately, then they were never seen again. And that's when they believe they wired the building. And they do believe, and my friend told me absolutely it was a thermite bomb with, it was a thermite bomb with potential sulfur in it. The sulfur, it makes it, the important thing about a thermite bomb is it It is an extraordinary heat-reducing bomb. Okay, it takes steel and it creates molten steel. So it takes beams of steel and it turns it into molten steel, and it just everything underneath just sinks into the ground like what you saw. It is a military-grade weapon. It's not something you could make ever in your kitchen or your garage or your living room. It is impossible for you to do this. This is a U.S. military weapon, and so I do believe that helps to explain some of the missing pieces. And I believe this is what happened. They'd known about the terrorist attack for months. There is a long-term advanced knowledge. Assets are being watched. The so-called terrorists, whether you want to think of them as whether they're real, Mohammed Atta was an asset trained by the United States government, supervised by the United States government. And I can assure you that assets, and I'm speaking directly from my own personal experience, assets are heavily controlled individuals. I was never dealing with Iraq and Libya without somebody paying extremely close attention to me at every
This asset, Osama bin Laden, reading about the 15 of the 19 hijackers getting visas from the CIA's consulate in Jeddah, I thought, obviously, I didn't do any good at all.
I can assure you that assets, and I'm speaking directly from my own personal experience, assets are heavily controlled individuals. I was never dealing with Iraq and Libya without somebody paying extremely close attention to me at every stage, and my phones were tapped. I mean, at some point they had wired my house. There's no way that these assets could have functioned without everyone knowing every single detail of what they were doing. There's no way they could have hidden. They could not have disguised their actions from their handlers. Even if they tried to disguise it, it wouldn't work. Believe me, it wouldn't work. No, it's impossible. Impossible. And so it's more likely that they were using Mohammed Atta to guide the conspiracy, to track the conspiracy, and then they discovered that they were bozo pilots, they were clowns, they weren't any good at this flying stuff. They had an agenda. And the agenda was that when this attack happened, they were going to go to war with Iraq. But oh gosh, we've got a problem now. Because the problem is they're not going to be able to do the job. Uh-oh. Oh. See, here's the thing about and I'm speaking now, again, from experience. The 1993 World Trade Center attack killed 5 people. The bombing of the USS Cole killed 12 people. And once the smoke clears and the catastrophe, the chaos is over, and the noise is done, it's pretty, it's like, it's all, there's not a lot of damage that would certainly not enough that would allow a government, a pro-war cabal, to throw itself into a new war with Iraq, which they wanted to do. They've already decided to do it. And so that is the motivation. The thing is, there can never be any police officer will tell you, there is no crime without a motive and opportunity. And we had both. So it's not like they just spontaneously wired the World Trade Center. They knew it was coming, and they wanted to make sure that they had maximum damage when it hit. They knew they were going to use the airplanes as the cover to demolish the building. So it's not, a lot of people attacked me, and they said, you're saying there were airplane hijackings. No, there was a demolition. And I'm like saying, no, there's both of it. Both things happened. They knew this. They knew the airplanes were going to be hijacked, so they used it as a cover for to guarantee maximum destruction because they already knew the consequence of war. This is a very good question because it's really questionable that there was a jihadi plot. I do believe there were hijackers. Now, I have to tell you that I do believe there were hijackers. On the other hand, I know that the people that they did identify were assets. Okay? They worked for the United States government. And they were the men who were identified as the hijackers were not jihadis. They were not devoutly religious men. They went to strip clubs, they drank alcohol, they smoked cigarettes, they chased women. Real, deep, authentic jihadis would do none of that.
Video cameras caught
arriving at the World Trade Center from about August 23rd until every night until about September 2nd, September 3rd. And the trucks were arriving at about 3 o'clock in the morning when everybody else had left the building, including the janitorial trucks. And the trucks were leaving at 5 a.m. right before the AAA personalities of Wall Street got to work to start their day. Something was brought into that building that would help with the detonation. There may have been work done on the detonation before. It may have been going on for months, but whatever they needed at the very end, they came and brought in that 10-day period. That's what we think happened. The airplane hijackings were a cover for the controlled demolition. And in August of 2001, I was told to stay out of New York City because the attack was considered imminent. We expected mass casualties and a possible miniature thermonuclear strike, bomb. However, I want to be very clear. The attack was always defined as airplane hijackings and a strike on the World Trade Center.
The largest intelligence apparatus in the world, with the biggest budget in the history of the world, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years, and can't find him. Some doofus jerk-off reporter with a camera crew waltzes right into his hideout and interviews him. So why do all these fools believe this charade? That a CNN reporter and his little camera crew can do with all the money and all the assets and all the eavesdropping and all the intelligence and all the satellites and all the undercover operatives in the world can never do. It's because they're not trying, they don't want to. Osama bin Laden is their creation, and he is serving them well. I mean, is this some kind of incredible joke that people are so stupid they fall for this? And now we're being bombarded with messages that Osama bin Laden is planning to attack the United States of America and Israel. And I'm telling you, be prepared for a major attack. But it won't be Osama bin Laden, and whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it. And whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it.
Another element of the official story about the alleged hijackers is that they were very devout Muslims. The 9/11 Commission report said that Atta had become very religious, even fanatically so. The public was thereby led to believe that these men would have no problem with a suicide mission because they were ready to meet their maker. But investigator-reporter Daniel Hopsecker discovered that Atta loved cocaine, alcohol, gambling, pork, and lap dances.
Atta frequented this Sarasota strip joint, conveniently located next to a nearby dog track. A young man with money to burn, Muhammad Atta enjoyed very un-Islamic lap dances here, and also at places like the Pink Pony Strip Club in Daytona Beach and the Olympic Garden, a grind joint on the seedier end of the strip in Las Vegas. Stuffing $20 bills into the panties of topless dancers must be frowned on, don't you think, by fundamentalist Saudi mullahs? But it wasn't all seedy strip clubs. When not ogling infidel flesh, Atta had a taste for the finer things as well, like hanging out at Harry's Bar in New York, for example, where he preferred a table near the piano. We can see someone in Arab Spy, for example, having a preference for a table near the piano at Harry's Bar. But an Islamic fundamentalist? 3 nights before the attack, Muhammad Atta, Marwan Shehi, and Siad El-Jarrah drank at this Fort Lauderdale bar. It gained immediate notoriety. Federal agents flashed pictures of the terrorist pilots who just a day earlier had demolished the World Trade Center to the manager Tony Amos and Patricia Adrisi, the bartender. We were able to recognize both gentlemen, Amos said. Atta drank Stolichnaya vodka for 3 straight hours, the bartender remembered. Marwan al-Shehi was drinking rum. They were very rude, she said. They didn't want to pay the bill. When asked if they could afford the $48 bar tab, Atta pulled out a thick roll. Mohammed said he worked for American Airlines and he could pay the bill, she told reporters. The guy Mohammed was drunk, Amos said.
And they all looked of the, I guess, Egyptian, like, kind of dark skin, dark hair. Lots of jewelry, lots of jewelry. They're dressed like in Florida-type shirts, you know, the silk with the pattern and that kind of thing. And I could have swore.
Pork, Several of the other alleged hijackers had similar taste, reported the Wall Street Journal. The commission pretends, however, that none of this information was available. While admitting that Atta met other members of Al-Qaeda in Las Vegas shortly before 9/11, it says that it saw no credible evidence explaining why, on this occasion and others, the operatives flew to or met in Las Vegas. Another problem in the official account is that although we are told that 4 or 5 of the alleged hijackers were on each of the flights, no proof of this claim has been provided. The story, of course, is that they did not force their way onto the planes, but they bought tickets. If so, their names should have been on the flight manifest. But the flight manifests that have been released contain neither the names of the alleged hijackers nor any Arab names whatsoever. We have also been given no proof that the remains of any of these men were found in the wreckage. One final little problem is that several of these 19 men, according to stories published by the BBC and British newspapers, are still alive.
That there were terrorists in this country for more than a year getting pilot training, and 2 of the suspects that have been identified by federal authorities were trained at a Huffman flying school, which is in Venice, Florida. Antonio Mora has gone down there this morning and has one of the directors of that school with him. Antonio?
Charlie, that is where I am here in Venice, Florida, and I am joined by Rudy Deckers, who is the owner and the chief executive officer of Huffman Aviation. And the training you give them is on single-engine, simple planes.
All very simple planes. Planes like you can see behind us, single-engine, light multi-engine planes. Nothing to be capable of to fly a jet.
This is the kind of plane that you fly. Do you think you're capable? You've got many, many years of experience. Would you be capable of moving a 757?
I fly occasionally in the back seat, in the back in these airlines, and I think by myself, oh, I wish I could fly for a minute this, but there's no way. There's no way. The systems are different. It's hydraulic. If you steer straight and you keep it at altitude, maybe you're able to do a little bit, but they had to descend, they had to change the speeds. There's no way, in my opinion.
All right, Rudy. Rudy Deckers of Huffman Aviation, we thank you for joining us this morning. I know you are shocked. This whole community is shocked, as is the rest of the country, but in particular here to know that these terrorists lived in their midst. Charlie, Diane?
Tonight we are also learning more about a September 11th hijacker from the man who taught him how to fly. Hani Hanjour is the terrorist who flew a hijacked plane into the Pentagon. He attended CRM flight school right here in Scottsdale. Today, Hanjour's instructor talked to KTAR Radio's Preston Westmoreland about his infamous student. Now, he wants to remain anonymous, so we are disguising his voice.
Hani Hanjour's instructor says he was devastated when he learned this death and destruction was caused by one of his students.
I was almost suicidal at that point because I felt so responsible for even just knowing these people.
What kind of a student was Hani Hanjour? A slow learner who started concerning his flight instructor when he refused to land the plane or practice stalls and steep turns.
He would just refuse. He would start crying and he would, refuse to do it. He would beg with me, plead with me not to.
Hanjour's instructor says he even had to cancel several flights because his student was so emotional. And when he saw what Hanjour did, there was a feeling that a trust was violated.
The terrorists, 6 of the terrorists, including Mohammed Atta, trained at U.S. military facilities. Okay? Muhammad Atta went to International Officers School at Maxwell Air Force Base.
The suicide hijacking of an inbound flight, as shown in a 2009 released document by the 9/11 Commission. Not to forget all the war games on the morning of 9/11 itself that strangely included a hijacking and fake inserts on the radar screens of the air defense, precisely while the real attacks were underway.
Yes, ma'am, Sergeant Rorta. Yes. I'm just letting you know for information we're having an exercise, SF exercise. We're having a calm out.
Okay.
Guys.
Happy, thanks.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
But then we discovered a story from September 15th's Washington Post stating Muhammad Atta had been to International Officers School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, and that others of the terrorists had attended the Aerospace Medical School at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas and the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. 3 of the terrorists had even listed their address on their driver's license as the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida, the story went on, where they participated in military exchange programs for foreign officers at the Pensacola Naval Air Station.
Let me begin our briefing. I'm gravely concerned about the information provided us just yesterday that the President received a warning in August about the threat of hijackers by Osama bin Laden and his organization. It clearly raises some very important questions that have to be asked and have to be answered. Why did it take 8 months for us to receive this information? And secondly, what specific actions were taken by the White House in response? So it is true that the Vice President has requested on several occasions that we not have an investigation into this issue, and I know that there are many of our colleagues who, on both sides of the aisle, I might say, who take a different point of view. I personally think that this issue now has become far more prominent, far more consequential, and needs to be investigated and clearly considered in a far more comprehensive way.
And there's no obvious reason in the record why for 15, 16 months they decide not to tell the FBI, and then one day they wake up and say they're going to tell the FBI. Ask yourself why, on September 4th, after they've told the FBI, but not told senior levels at the FBI, why not raise it in the September 4th principals meeting?
I mean, if I ask myself that, I don't...
There's a very obvious answer. What am I going to say? I know how all this stuff works. I've been working in it for 30 years. You can't snowball me on this stuff. If they announce on September 4th in the principals meeting that these guys are in the United States, then they told the FBI a few weeks ago, I'm going to say, wait, time out. How long have you known this? Why haven't you reported it at the daily threat meetings? Why isn't it in the daily threat matrix? We would have begun an investigation that day into CIA malfeasance and misfeasance. That's why we're not informed.
So they put their own asses above national security.
If you believe all of this, I can't prove this. I have a set of facts. And I'm trying to make sense of those facts. And I'm trying to come up with an explanation as to why those facts that we know are true occurred. The other 48 people in CIA who knew about it never mentioned it to me or anyone in my staff in a period of over 12 months.
They were stopped from getting to you and stopped from getting to the White House.
And stopped from getting to the FBI and the Defense Department. We therefore conclude that there was a high-level decision in the CIA ordering people not to share that information. There was not a lack of information sharing. They told us everything except this. If they had, even as late as September 4th, told me, we would have conducted a massive sweep. We would have conducted it publicly. We would have found those assholes. There's no doubt in my mind. Even with only a week left. They were using credit cards in their own names. They were staying in the Charles Hotel in Harvard Square, for heaven's sake. We would have found them. If we'd taken those pictures and put them out on the AP wire, those guys would have been arrested within 24 hours.
Have you asked George Tenet or Cofer Black or Richard Lee about any of this after the fact?
No.
The facts tripped out to you over time, right, over these investigations, and then you started
Took a while.
Yeah.
And so you've never approached them, so what's the...
You used to be kind of buddies with him, right? So
look at it this way. They've been able to get through a joint House investigation committee and get through the 9/11 Commission. And this has never come out. They got away with it. They're not going to tell you, even if you wanted more than
Read is that all three collapses were pretty close to classic examples of what they call controlled demolition. All three buildings. You can see them on all sorts of places on the website. You don't see them on TV anymore. They showed them the first night, and Dan Rather, bless his soul, comes right out and blurts out the truth. He says, "Boy, that looks just like controlled demolition." The 9/11 Commission also does not tell you that Marvin Bush, the president's brother, and their cousin, Wirt Walker, were the principals of the company that was in charge of security for the World Trade Center. They don't, all sorts of coincidences here. They also don't tell you that there were many reports of people who worked in the building saying, we got a shutdown order, so for 3 days we couldn't go in the World Trade Center. There were engineers coming in and out. We didn't know it.
You first off is, just tell us maybe what the atmosphere was leading up to 9/11, exactly what your job was and what you did there in the World Trade Center towers.
Sure. I worked for, as you said, Fiduciary Trust in the South Tower. I was based on the 97th floor, where our data center was. About 3 weeks prior to 9/11, our company, along with many others in the towers, were given notice that there was going to be a power down in the top 50% of floors in the southern tower. This was unprecedented. As you can imagine, a lot of financial institutions in the building, and to have a complete loss of power meant a complete loss of systems. And for an organization like my company, it was truly extraordinary.
And, you were notified by the Port Authority there'd be a 36-hour power down at the top half of your tower. Had there been anything like this prior to this particular power down? And exactly, give us a time frame of when you were notified about the power down as related to 9/11. What was the date of the power down, and had there been one prior to this?
Okay, the power down was on the Saturday and Sunday prior to 9/11, so that would have been the 8th and 9th of September. We were given 3 weeks notice. It was relatively short time notice period to make all the preparations needed. And it was unprecedented. We've never experienced a power down in the towers, as far as I am aware. I had worked in the towers from 1998. My colleagues who had been in the building well beyond that could not remember an occasion such as this, apart from the bomb incidents in the early 90s.
But looking back now, you noticed that there was some suspicious behavior with these workers.
One of the main reasons why I became suspicious was I got in touch with the Port Authority I got in touch with the 9/11 Commission to register this piece of information so that it would be acknowledged, if only to be thrown away. And I had no acknowledgement. They did not come back to me. I repeatedly called and wrote letters to them. I've had no acknowledgement. It's as if this information is of no interest to anyone, but to me it seems to be part of the puzzle and should be registered. I was not in the office on 9/11 because of working that weekend. I had the day off on the Tuesday, and so I was in my apartment, which overlooked the Trade Center. I lived in Jersey City, across the river from the towers, so I was eyewitness to what went on there. And as soon as I saw the first tower go down, the South Tower, I was highly suspicious. It just didn't look correct. It looked like a controlled demolition. It did not look like a building collapsing either from an aircraft hitting it or from a fire inside. It seemed to crumble into dust. It just didn't ring true.
Few who have seen them, they're known as the 28 pages.
In those pages are names of people who allegedly helped the Al-Qaeda killers, but who have never been held accountable.
Potential sources of foreign support for the September 11th hijackers, classified by the Bush administration. Why the 28 pages remain hidden from the public remains a mystery.
We know the 28 pages from Senator Graham and Senator Jones that have seen it, and military we've had on that have seen it. It says Saudi Arabia ran the attacks to blame Iraq. That was always the plan. And then our own government, bare minimum, stood down. And of course, it was more than that. But we have the fact that it now, to a great extent, was an inside job.
I have read the 28 pages, and the 28 pages have nothing to do with national security. Nothing, or I wouldn't be standing here. It's all about relationships and involvement in 9/11.
I want those documents declassified. I'm embarrassed to be associated with a work product that is secret.
I am convinced that there was a direct line between at least some of the terrorists who carried out the September 11th attacks and the government of Saudi Arabia. He called it a smoking gun, and he went on to say the reason for this cover-up goes right up to the White House.
It's sort of shocking when you read it. As I read it, we all had our own experience. I had to stop every couple pages and just sort of absorb and try to rearrange my understanding of history for the past 13 years and the years leading up to that. It challenges you to rethink everything.
The way the structure is collapsing, this was the result of something that was planned. It's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know.
We made it outside, we made it about a block. We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out. It was if it had detonated. Yeah, detonated. Yeah. Take down a building. All the way down. It was if it had detonated. Yeah, detonated. Yeah. Take down a building. All the way down. I was watching and running. Just ran away. Then you just sort of this cloud.
I lost my husband.
My son, my uncle, my nephew, September 11th, 2001.
Most people don't know a third tower fell that day.
The government says fire brought it down.
The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
I, along with 1,400 other architects and engineers,
found the government's conclusion to be physically impossible.
Impossible.
We need the truth about what happened that day.
Go to rememberbuilding7.org.
Number 7. On September 11th, 2001, it was one of the casualties of the terrorist attacks on that horrific day. Building 7's sudden and shocking collapse has been overshadowed by the fate of the Twin Towers. But from an engineering standpoint, it is the greater mystery.
We were surprised that Tower 7 collapsed. We being the team that investigated what occurred on that day. There was some damage to Tower 7 caused by the debris that hit it from Tower 1, but the damage was certainly not similar in scope or magnitude to that caused by the aircraft hitting Towers 1 and 2.
The only positive aspect of this building's demise is that it fell 7 hours after the 2 main towers. Everyone had been evacuated, and even though the 47-story building collapsed in on itself in under 10 seconds, no one was killed.
New York City, or NIST.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires. We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse. And in fact, we've shown for the first time that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
NIST used detailed data describing the building and its contents to create the most complex computer simulation of a structure collapse ever made. Falling debris from Tower 1 started fires on 10 floors in Building 7. A break in the city water main from the collapse of the towers disabled sprinklers in the lower half of WTC 7, allowing fires on those floors to burn for 7 hours. The NIST computer model was validated with evidence from videos, photos, witness accounts, and other data. It shows that heat from fires expanded long support beams, causing connections and floors to fail.
So you look at the floors failing here, and eventually this column 79 is going to buckle, it fails, and then the entire vertical progression takes place.
If the buildings had come down by fire, we would have seen a more natural progression of collapse.
And clearly a more asymmetrical pattern should have been present.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
The exterior columns on the outside as on the inside at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
I worked for Controlled Demolition Incorporated, CDI, the top-rated explosives demolition firm in the world. As an explosives loader, my job was to place explosives in the buildings to prepare them for demolition. I was licensed while in New York by the New York Fire Department to handle explosives. And I worked on major projects such as Seattle Kingdom, the Three River Stadium, Philadelphia Naval Hospital, and Keyspan gas holders in New York. What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it. That's another indicator that this NIST report is very suspect. Very suspect.
When it's all finished, the outside walls are piled one on top of the other right in the middle of the building. Just like a house of cards if it were coming down.
As a structural engineer, I don't believe that the failure of one column would normally bring down an entire building in the way we saw World Trade Center 7 come down.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense.
5:20 p.m. on September 11, 2001, World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed in 6.5 seconds from normal office fires, according to the government's final report. It finally admitted that Building 7 collapsed at the rate of freefall after trying to deny it. So what's wrong with a building in freefall? What is freefall?
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet.
This is high school physics.
A building cannot do free fall with 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system without it being blown up.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
The NIST team found no evidence that explosives were involved in the collapse.
And our analysis showed that even the smallest explosive charge that was capable of bringing down the critical column in the building, had it occurred, we would have seen sound levels of 120 to 130 decibels about a half a mile away. That would have been an incredibly loud sound, and that sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to.
NIST computed what they claimed would be the minimum loudness of an explosion that could sever column 79 with a single blast. Then they claimed no observers detected explosions as loud as their predictions.
This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
On the basis of this artificial threshold of interest, they swept aside all evidence of actual explosions and concluded that no explosives contributed to the destruction of the building.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7.
Yet there was voluminous evidence of explosions.
Here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
You heard explosions. Like, whoo!
We just heard one more explosion. That's about the fourth one we've heard.
Yeah.
The brown building, the tall one, is number 7 World Trade Center. I've heard several reports from several different officers now that that is the building that is going to go down next.
Are on the phone with New York Fire Department Lieutenant David Restuccio. Lieutenant, where are you right now?
I'm at the corner of Northmore Street and Greenwich Street.
Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day?
We had heard reports that the building was unstable and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down.
It's going down right now.
There it is.
Yeah.
It went down right there. This is not from an explosion or an aircraft at this point, from our knowledge. The information that we have is that this is a building that probably was incredibly structurally damaged.
NIST is being dishonest. There was both testimony and recorded evidence of explosions. However, NIST discounted any evidence of explosions that did not exceed its artificially contrived threshold of interest. The minimum sound level of interest, as determined by NIST, was based on a blast of RGX, one of the loudest explosives available, large enough to break a major column outright with a single blast. It assumed no efforts at noise abatement, complete transmission of the sound to the outside air, no absorption or blockage of the sound along the path, and was to create a pretext to sidestep any actual investigation of explosives. Why would NIST or anyone else choose to exclude from its investigation any evidence of any explosions related to the destruction of the building?
At the same time, it should be noted that NIST's report on Building 7 was never published by a peer-reviewed publication. This means their analysis of the collapse cannot be validated from a scientific point of view. Even though this was an unprecedented event in history, we are being asked by NIST to take their word for the soundness of their conclusions.
It's based on sound science, and it is consistent with all the observations we have.
But it has never happened before, right?
But the physics is consistent, it's sound, it's been analyzed, and we have the results. And we are very comfortable with our findings.
They might have been comfortable, but the scientific community of architects and engineers was not.
Science is never secret when it's done right. Science isn't science unless it's published, unless it's openly published and made available for criticism.
Architects and Engineers has asked NIST to at least verify the computer model on which they base their theory of the collapse. But also in this case, NIST has refused to make their data public.
Structural engineers rail against NIST because they refuse to show the visualization. It's a black box. You cannot download any of this data.
This means that also for the accuracy of their computer model, we have to take NIST's word for it. In order to justify the first and only collapse in the history of a steel skyscraper due to fire, the debunkers have maintained that Building 7 was weaker than the average steel structure because it had been built over an existing electrical substation.
The building was extremely unconventional. It had this giant Con Ed substation with enormous trusses carrying extraordinarily high loads, very vulnerable to fire and other kinds of damage.
But NIST itself has refuted this possibility. From the final report we read, the transfer elements such as trusses, girders, and cantilever overhangs that were used to support the office building over the Con Edison substation did not play a significant role in the collapse of World Trade Center 7. In fact, it was the opposite. After it was completed, Larry Silverstein had the building reinforced beyond its requirements in order to accommodate the needs of its main tenant, Salomon Brothers. In a New York Times article we read, Salomon Brothers intends to spend nearly 2 years and more than $200 million cutting out floors, adding elevators, reinforcing steel girders, upgrading power supplies, and making other improvements in its million square feet of space. We built in enough redundancy to allow entire portions of floors to be removed without affecting the building's structural integrity, said Larry Silverstein, president of the company. More than 375 tons of steel, requiring 12 miles of welding, will be installed to reinforce floors for Solomon's extra equipment. If there was one skyscraper in the world that should have never collapsed due to fire, it was Building 7.
Zie je vanaf boven gaan? Nee, je gaat vanaf onder.
Die gaat vanaf onder, ja.
Toch?
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Ze is nagesprongen.
Dit valt anders dan het World Trade Center.
Vind je niet dan?
Ja, je ziet het, de onderste verdiepingen gaan eerst.
Ja, en de rest zakt er gewoon in. Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dat heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Maar dit is ook op 11 september gebeurd.
Dezelfde dag?
Dezelfde dag.
Dezelfde dag? Weet je dat zeker?
Ja.
Was het zeker weten de 11e? Totaal waar zijn.
7 uur nadat de World Trade Center naar beneden viel.
Ja? Hebben ze hard gewerkt?
In het officiële onderzoeksrapport van FEMA staat dat ze niet kunnen verklaren waarom gebouw nummer 7 is ingestort.
Het is vakwerk, zonder meer. We weten heel goed wat ze doen, die jongens.
De vraag is dan, is zoiets van tevoren voorbereid of kan dat op 11 september zelf nog zijn besloten en uitgevoerd?
Met hoeveel man heeft u hoeveel tijd nodig om dat te doen?
Dat weet ik niet precies, maar...
Maakt u een inschatting?
Ja, dan moet je wel ervaren mensen hebben, maar als je een man of 30, 40 zou hebben. Kijk, een paar met de snijbrander, de rest brengt hem aan. Andere mensen sluiten dat bedkoord met die boosters aan. Dat moet allemaal precies op hetzelfde moment gaan. En weer een derde die zet de elektronische systemen erop. En dan gaat hij.
Terwijl overal brand was en ook in dat gebouw was brand.
Ja, niet geblust.
Ze hebben de brand niet geblust. Dus de mensen die dat moesten doen, die moesten het doen terwijl het binnen nog brandde.
Ja, dat is vreemd. Dat is vreemd. Dat vind ik ook heel vreemd. Ik heb geen verklaring voor.
So we subsequently went to the stairwell and we're going down the stairs. When we reached the 8th or the 6th floor, the landing that we were standing on gave way. There was an explosion and the landing gave way. And I was left there hanging. I had to climb back up and now I had to walk back up to the 8th floor. When I made it to the 6th floor and there was an explosion, the explosion was beneath me. Keep in mind now, it's pitch black in there. All the lights went out. So when the explosion happened, it blew us back. I'm thinking I'm standing on the landing. I'm actually holding on to a pole above us. And I had to climb back up because Hess is yelling, "What do we do now?" I said, "There's only one thing we can do, and it's go back up." Both buildings were still standing. Both buildings were still standing. So the fire department came and ran. They came twice. Why? Because building tower 1 fell and tower 2 fell. And then when they came back with all concern now, like, to get me the hell out of here. I was trapped in there for several hours. I was trapped in there when both buildings came down. All this time, I'm hearing all types of explosions. All this time, I'm hearing explosions. When they finally got to us, and they took us down to what they called the lobby, because I asked them, I said, when we got down there, I said, "Where are we?" He said, "This was the lobby." And I said, "You gotta be kidding me." Total ruins. Total ruins. Now keep in mind, when I came in there, the lobby had nice escalators. It was a huge lobby. And for me to see what I saw, it was unbelievable. This big giant police officer came to me. And he says, "You have to run." I said, "I can't run, my knees are swollen." He said, "You're gonna have to get on your knees and crawl in." He said, "Because they have reports of more explosions." And that's when I started crawling. And I saw this guy fall behind me. His comrades came to his aid. They dragged him to safety. I'm just confused about one thing, and one thing only. Why World Trade Center 7 went down in the first place. I'm very confused about that. I know what I heard. I heard explosions. The explanation I got was it was the fuel oil tank. I'm an old boiler guy. If it was a fuel oil tank, it would have been one side of the building. Yes, you can.
And the whole time you hear thum, 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 thum. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it, you know. I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down, and I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it.
The Red Cross rep was like, he goes over and he says, well, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about bringing the building down. They didn't say what building, they just said bringing a building down.
All I can attest to is that by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word we're going to have to bring it down.
Keep your eye on that building. It's coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys. Sorry.
We are looking back. The building about to blow up.
So we're like, okay, you know, we'll take their word before it. You know, we'll stay behind the line. And he went over and he talked to one of the, through all the commotion, he goes over and he asked one of the Red Cross, or one of the firefighters, what was going on. I guess, I don't know if he got an answer or not. He came back over with his hand over the radio, and it sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! And it's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 boom. Like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Just in the last few seconds, another building number 7, one of the buildings in support of the World Trade Center towers, has collapsed. This is no small building, as you can see, at 47 stories. It would stand out in most American cities.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire. There has never been until 9/11 an experience where a high-rise building that was steel frame completely collapsed. There have been fires burned longer in similar structures without any collapse.
In my previous career as a firefighter, normally you'd never be afraid to go into a Type 1 building because they're not combustible, and you would just charge at it and put the fire out. Never in my training were we ever taught that these type of buildings could just collapse in on themselves. There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
The World Trade Center 7 building reminds me of the Meridian Bank building in some ways in Philadelphia. The Meridian Bank building is a 38-story skyscraper that burned for 18 hours in 1991, suffered extensive damage from the fire, but did not collapse.
I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. For the 40-plus years that I've been practicing architecture, I have designed a variety of buildings from small houses to high-rise office buildings. Some of the high-rises that I've worked on are 1-shell and 2-shell here in Houston. I was project manager for a 22-story office building in Akron, Ohio. Later in the day, when World Trade Center 7 collapsed, they had already showed us pictures of a few fires in that building, and I mean, they weren't even raging. And how could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
At 8
6:46 and 40 seconds, American Airlines Flight 11 hits the North Tower of the World Trade Center, causing extensive damage between the 93rd and the 99th floors.
That tower just came down.
How did those towers come down? Well, before we were told what to think by the experts, let's listen to what some eyewitnesses said.
Actually, devices that were planted in the building. There was another explosion that took huge explosion that we all heard. An explosion, and another explosion.
All that evidence of explosions was quickly ignored or dismissed. The next morning, the experts had already figured out how those towers fell. In just under an hour, a raging fire from burning aviation gasoline softened or perhaps melted the steel. And we were told that melted steel story for months. The intense fire caused the tower to collapse. It melted the structural steel. What the firemen might not have realized is the gushing jet fuel was melting the steel. Steel melts, and 24,000 gallons of aviation fluid melted the steel.
As the steel began to soften and melt, the interior core columns began to give.
Indeed, there was plenty of evidence of melted steel, including this, and this, molten spheres of iron, steel like Swiss cheese, and of course this. But over time, this melted steel story changed. Even today, the media report and many scientists believe that the steel melted. This is not true. And NIST said that the molten steel was irrelevant to the investigation of the collapse, since it does not provide conclusive information on the condition of the steel when the towers were standing. John Gross of NIST, who was at the yard observing plenty of evidence, denied its very existence.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so.
Except these firemen.
You get down below and you see molten steel running down the channel rails.
And this eyewitness.
The fires got very intense down there and actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
And this architect.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
Molten iron in explosions is easily explained by incendiaries and explosives, but not by fires. So that evidence had to be ignored and denied. If there...
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion, and everybody just started running for the door. Everybody was trapped.
Doctors treating the injured here say most of the 100 patients treated so far are suffering not just smoke inhalation and eye damage, but fractures. Many of them have told the doctors that they were responding to the attack on the South Tower when they were suddenly trapped by the second explosion, and many of the fractures they're suffering come not from fallen debris, but from the concussive force of the explosion, which slammed them against walls, knocked them to the ground, or slammed them up against their own ambulances.
He thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building. He thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building. He says that he probably lost a great many men in those secondary explosions, and he said that there were literally hundreds, if not thousands of people in those two towers when the explosions took place. He said
there was a lot of talk there in New York of another explosion prior to the collapse of the first building.
Whether it was a bomb or whether the first plane that crashed into the tower had somehow been booby-trapped,
with a bomb that was timed to explode later after the crash had occurred. But CNN is reporting that there was a third explosion that caused World Trade Center 1 to collapse within itself and then collapse on other surrounding buildings.
50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
We heard the noise associated with an implosion.
This claimed that the upper section of each of the towers crushed the lower section. However, when you watch video closely, in the case of World Trade Center 1, you'll see that the upper section disintegrates itself. It appears to be the upper section.
The top section pushing on the bottom section, it's going to meet equal forces as it goes. You're looking for a jolt, that this thing, if it actually comes down and hits, you should be able to see the point at which they actually impact, because it would actually slow down the motion of the falling block.
Buildings tend to fall over. They don't fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance. Buildings tend to fall over. This is a controlled demolition. Typically, a tall building like this is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams, detonating them in a very precise order. This is a controlled demolition. Synchronistically timed, floor by floor, detonating them in a very precise order. This is a controlled demolition. Synchronistically timed, floor by floor. This is a controlled demolition. So the result is an implosion. This is a controlled demolition. So the result is an implosion. This is a controlled demolition. We have straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint. This is a controlled demolition. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. This is a controlled demolition. We have straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint. This is a controlled demolition. This is a controlled demolition. Synchronistically timed, floor by floor. This is a controlled demolition. So the result is an implosion. This is a controlled demolition. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. This is a controlled demolition. This is a controlled demolition. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. This is a controlled demolition. This is a controlled demolition. This is a controlled demolition. So the result is an implosion. This is a controlled demolition. We have straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint. This is a controlled demolition. Fires affect buildings quite differently than controlled demolition. Typically, a tall building like this is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams. First, let the technical truths emerge. Then, if necessary, cope with the inevitable conspiracy and other questions.
Richard Gage, who is a member of the American Institute of Architects. He's also the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Gary. Great to be here today. This was shocking to me. I'm on my way to a construction observation meeting, and I couldn't believe my ears. This is as somebody's explaining what happened to the Twin Towers that I knew nothing about. I thought it was just a gravitational collapse, according to the official story. And now I'm hearing that there's beams flying out of the towers and landing 600 feet away with molten metal pouring off the ends of them and so forth. I was shocked with it. So I did some research, put a presentation together. After that, took it to the 15 architects and engineers, architects that I worked for. They thought I was nuts until I showed them in this conference room with pizza that I had to bribe them to get them there. They all agreed with me afterwards, and they signed my petition, except for my boss, who was Middle Eastern. He was afraid to sign it. But that was it. That was our first 15 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Now we have 1,500. And virtually every architect and engineer who looks at this evidence is convinced It's really amazing how overwhelmingly simple it is to understand, and people are shocked that they didn't hear about this from our government or media. Everybody knows who sees this building that it's a controlled demolition. It doesn't take rocket science to realize that a free-falling building can't destroy 40,000 tons of structural framework in it that's 5 times stronger than it needed to be to keep that building up. Fire doesn't have this precision. A controlled demolition with explosives is the answer as to how this can happen. And there's evidence of these incendiaries in this case.
What type of incendiaries would most likely be used?
Well, we're talking about thermite, because there's several tons of molten metal found underneath all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers, by the way, which NIST never looked at. They said, oh, there would have been a huge bomb going off. Well, no, we're talking about incendiaries here. They don't have the loud bangs of C4 or RDX, typical high-energy explosives. They don't have the bright flashes. This is a deceptive controlled demolition. An international team of scientists also finds small red-gray chips in the dust. These turn out to be nanothermite composite explosives because there's extremely small particles.
So they've actually discovered, they've found in the dust the non-detonated explosive charges.
Yeah, well, we can call them incendiaries that are designed to be explosives because of the extremely small size, nanoscale aluminum oxide and iron oxide and aluminum powders that are intimately mixed and in the perfect proportion in these red-gray chips to become thermite. But because of their size, they can be engineered to become explosive. Now, how would they have gotten in there past all the occupants to plant those explosives? Well, in the elevator shafts, where there are no occupants above and below the elevator cabs, somebody could have planted those explosives, a group of, a large team acting over a period of months. And an elevator modernization would have given the perfect cover, and in fact that's exactly what we had in the Twin Towers, the largest elevator modernization in history. Now this is documented in 2000, March of 2000, Elevator World. And this would have given the perfect cover to plant these explosives.
March of 2000 is when the elevators were reconditioned?
For the 9 months prior to 9/11, those elevators were under modernization by Ace Elevator. So we want an investigation of Ace Elevator, who had 85 employees at the time the first jet hit, and they scattered. They left. It was a scandal. And USA Today documented this shortly after 9/11. They're supposed to stay around and help. They're experts in the delivery systems, the elevators, to help the first responders.
So where is Ace Elevator now?
Well, they went out of business shortly after that, and I understand they're back in business again.
Interesting.
I think a bomb went off the lobby first, then a plane hit the building, then another plane hit the other building. But when I was coming through the doors on the other side of the Trade Center, either they blew the lobby up or something, because it blew the glass out of the doors and knocked us all down, and I got smoke and everything on me. I just feel a little shook up because I got blasted,
In fact, he remembers quite clearly exactly what Cheney was doing as the plane approached.
During the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the vice president, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, do the orders still stand? And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
Did we just hear confirmation that there was indeed a stand-down order that morning? That is, an order to, in effect, let the plane hit the Pentagon.
Outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
seemed odd to me. I started looking at Marsh and some of the people that worked for them, and I noticed there were a couple of Bush family members, like Craig Stapleton, who is the husband of George W. Bush's cousin, and he was there. He used to be Bush's partner in the Texas Rangers deal that made him so much money. I also noticed L. Paul Bremer. This guy stood out just glaringly. L. Paul Bremer was 2 years later the Iraq occupation governor, so people may remember him better for that. But on 9/11, he was the CEO of Marsh Crisis, a division of Marsh and McLennan, and he had an office in the South Tower. So when I started looking at these floors in the different areas of the towers, I noticed that these matched up. And Marsh had not only the entire impact zone of the North Tower, but they had a subsidiary right in the middle of the South Tower, and L. Paul Bremer had an office there. Bremer was one of the first people to start giving us the official story for what happened. He somehow survived the day. I don't know how. He had his office there, but instead of going to his office, he had showed up on all the news stations telling us Osama bin Laden was responsible, and probably Iraq and Iran also, and that we really ought to start a massive war against those people. So that's interesting. The other thing that was interesting about Bremer was he was a director for a Japanese company called Komatsu that had just patented a thermite demolition device in 1996. So, and published the patent. So that I thought was interesting enough that maybe it should be investigated. Over in the South Tower impact zone, there's a couple of companies that occupied that. One of them was called Aon. And again, Bush's first cousin Jim Pierce worked right there in the South Tower impact zone. He had a meeting scheduled for that day. Then he moved across the street to the Millennium Hotel, and so he survived the day miraculously. There's also Baseline Financial right there in the impact zone. This guy named Joseph Casputis was really interesting to me because he was very closely related to the Department of Energy, and also just above him was a company called the Washington Group, and they were also very closely related to the Department of Energy and had just purchased a company called Morrison Knudsen that did hundreds of demolition projects for the Army Corps of Engineers. So there are a lot of people in these buildings, tenants in these buildings, that had connections to demolition technology. They had connections to the Department of Energy. They had a lot of connections to the Bush family for whatever reason. And so that's just that one article stands on its own. And then I went to the security design companies and contractors and found Kroll. A lot of people know about Kroll. It's this massive security company that also used to be called the CIA of Wall Street, and for their investigative work. And Kroll designed the security systems for the World Trade Center complex after the 1993 bombing. And the design was implemented by a couple of companies, one of them being this company called Stratisec, that people often talk about, this Ward Walker, and his being a relative of the Bush family. He's kind of just a distant relative, but he's a very interesting person. He appears to be connected to the CIA, not only through his father, who worked for the CIA and the DIA, but through other circumstantial pieces of evidence. But Stratisec Walker, he hired a bunch of people from the Carlyle Group, a subsidiary of the Carlyle Group. So his chief operating officer, he took him from BDM International, which is a Carlyle Group subsidiary. And BDM had a history in black projects. So Stratisec is very interesting for all these connections to not only Walker, but Marvin Bush, who was the president's brother, was a director at Stratisec. And they hired all these Carlyle Group people, including McDaniel. And they implemented the overall security plan right up to the day the buildings fell down. So I thought that was interesting.
And we got in a vehicle, and the kid driving the thing felt like 100 miles an hour. I mean, we're bouncing along, charging along. Finally, I told the guy, I said, "Son, slow down. I mean, Al Qaeda's not here. Al Qaeda's not here. Al Qaeda's not here." That's about as humorous a moment as it gets. The decision was made to go to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. My question was, who did it? The head of the CIA, George Tenet, believed it was Al Qaeda. It had the earmarks of an Al Qaeda attack. But Tenet wasn't that definitive yet. So my first indication it could be Al Qaeda was during the national security meeting at Offutt Air Force Base. So my first indication it could be Al Qaeda was during the national security meeting at Offutt Air Force Base. Al-Qaeda's not here. Al-Qaeda's not here. Al-Qaeda's not here.
I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, you know, it's time for politics. And, it's an absurd insinuation.
Been in Iraq, we have destabilized the Middle East.
But so you still think he should be impeached?
I think it's my turn, isn't it? You do whatever you want. You call it whatever you want. I want to tell you, they lied. Okay. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
All right.
The CIA is an army of individuals who have a license to kill. It's like Murder Incorporated, right?
Oh, are you kidding? The CIA makes the mafia look like a Sunday school class. I mean, this is the problem with what's actually happening in Afghanistan. Look, the CIA has done in this country, what they've done to us is unbelievable. Look at the terrorist acts that have occurred. The CIA behind most, if not all of them. We had the Marine Barracks, their embassy in Kenya. We had Pan Am 103. We had the USS Cole. We had Oklahoma City. We had the World Trade Center in 1993. Our government was involved in some of those. I can't say all of them because I don't know, but I do have documentation that there was government implication.
The president would have to know about it.
Of course he does.
And that would mean that Bush had prior knowledge, and that would implicate him in reality, if we wanted to face this thing as it really is, in murder, in the first degree.
You were both in Skull and Bone at the secret society. It's so secret we can't talk about it. What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go wild.
I'm sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the web.
Number 322.
I rise in opposition of this bill, but I would like to clarify something. We're not trying to scare kids. This president's foreign policy is what's scaring the kids of this country. And that people have said today, why are people believing this? Why are people believing this big internet hoax? Well, it's the same people that told us Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. Same people that told us Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Same people that told us we were going to be able to use the oil for reconstruction money. Same people that told us that we'd be greeted as liberators, not occupiers. Same people, same president that told us the Taliban is gone. Same president that told us that Poland is our ally 2 days before they pull out. Same president that tells us Iraq is going just great. Same president that tells us the economy is going just great. Same people that told us the tax cut was going to create millions of jobs. Same people that told us that the Medicare program only cost $400 billion when it really cost $540 billion. So please forgive us for not believing what you're saying. Please forgive the students of this country for not believing what you're saying. Not one thing about this war that has been told to the American people or that has been told to these college students has been true. Not one thing.
There are secrets that George W. Bush guards at least as carefully as any entrusted to a president. Secrets he's forbidden to share even with the vice president. Secrets he's held ever since his days at Yale, where in his senior year, like his father and his grandfather, he belonged to Skull and Bones, the elite secret society whose members include some of the most powerful men of the 20th century. All bonesmen, as they're called, are forbidden to reveal what goes on in their inner sanctum, the windowless building on the Yale campus called the Tomb. President Bush has tapped 5 fellow bonesmen to join his administration. Most recently, the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, William Donaldson, Skull and Bones, 1953.